Okay, Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Nedarim daf Yud Beis Nedarim 12. We're going to start on Yud Aleph Amud Beis around 8 lines from the bottom. Oh, I see why they did this. Okay, so the Gemara says, Bai Rami Bar Chama. So Rami Bar Chama asked the following question. If a person says, Hare alai kibasar zivchei shlamim, if a person says that this meat is upon me, like the meat of a korban shlamim, like if you compare your loaf of bread to a sacrifice, it's going to be prohibited because it's sacrificial, because sacrifice is prohibited upon you. But a shlamim, after you sprinkle the blood, it becomes permitted. So if you say this is upon me like the meat of a korban shlamim, after its blood is sprinkled, what will be the law? Mahu. Would we say, so is the loaf of bread going to be permitted? So the Gemara says, well, obviously, obviously, if you use that expression, we're saying it's like meat after its blood was sprinkled, the meat of a sacrifice after its blood was sprinkled, obviously it's permitted. You're comparing it to something that's permitted. Obviously, it's going to be permitted. There's no issue there. So the Gemara says, Ella Kagon, what we're referring to is Kagon to Machis, Basar Zivchei Shlamim, Umachis Te'atera Gabe. No, what we're obviously referring to is where you have this meat of the shlamim after the blood was sprinkled, lying in front of you, and you have something that's permitted in front of you, like your loaf of bread. And the Amar, and he says, Zeh kazeh, and you point at your loaf of bread and you say, this is like this, pointing at the shlamim after its meat blood was sprinkled. So what Rami Bar Chama is asking is, mikaro kamatfis, or be'atera kamatfis? Is he comparing it to something that's permitted, or is he comparing it to the essential aspect of it, i.e. prior to the blood was sprinkled, the essential aspect of the shlamim, and so therefore it'd be prohibited before its blood was sprinkled, or is he comparing it to after its blood was sprinkled and to the permitted aspect of it? Is he comparing it to the essential aspect before its blood was sprinkled, or now after its blood was sprinkled? So Amar Rava, so Rava says, let's try and answer this question. Rava says, let's try and answer this question. So he says hold on. I don't know, I got this all messed up here. Okay, so he says, so Amar Rava says, Tashma, let's bring a proof from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, if you compare it to, the Mishnah said that if you say my loaf of bread is like noser or pigel, then it's going to be prohibited. No, we're going to focus here on the noser. The noser is the leftover sacrificial meat, the meat that is expired. You have to have eaten by a certain point, either 2 days or 1 day, depending on the type of sacrifice. It's prohibited. So Tashma noser pigel. If you compare it to the noser pigel, it's prohibited. The Gemara says the noser pigel. We're on top of 12a. When are we referring to when we say the noser pigel? So there's a basic law that in order for a vow to take effect, it needs to be compared to something that otherwise would have been permitted. So we can't be referring to the noser after the animal meat had expired, because then it was already prohibited for sure. So it could only be referring to the meat after its blood was sprinkled, because that's the only way it could possibly become noser. And yet and at that point, it was permitted, and yet we're saying it's prohibited, and so it must be that we're comparing it back to the essential aspect of it before its blood was sprinkled, and yet we're saying it's prohibited. So we see from here be karo kamatvis, that we compare it back to the essential aspect. That's what the Gemara explains. Noser pigel, it's after the blood is sprinkled, and yet we compare it to that aspect, to the Ikaro. And so we see from here, Ikaro kamatvis. So Gemara says, no, no, what we're talking about is ben noser shel olah. We're talking about the noser of an olah offering, which even after its blood is sprinkled, the meat remains prohibited, because an olah offering, none of the meat is consumed by the owners or the kohen. And so therefore, it's not necessarily proof that we say Ikaro kamatvis. So Amar, so when Rav Huna Breder Rav Nassan gave this answer, they responded to him. So they responded to him. So Rava responded to Rav Huna Breder Rav Nasan. Rava responds, it can't be. He said, well, if that's the case, listen, but basar olah. Why does it have to say benoser? It could have just said by the meat of an olah. Why does it say specifically by noser? So the Gemara says, Lomi by kamar. No, it's a formulation. Lomi by basar olah. Our Mishnah could have said, not only by the basar of an olah would the vow take effect and be prohibited. The asar carbon kamatfis, because he's comparing it to an actual sacrifice. No, so when we buy basar olah the asar, carbon carbon kamatfis, and carbon is something that you can take a vow upon, and so therefore it's prohibited. But also, no pigul to olah it's stricha. But also, he needs to teach us that if you compare it to the no pigul of an olah, it's also going to take effect. Because we might have thought, we might have thought that's as though you said ki'isur noter and ki'isur pigul. It's as though you compared it specifically to a vow of noser or pigul. It's as though you might have thought it's as though you compared it to something that's prohibited. And so therefore, it's not what's called a davar another, in which case a vow would take effect on a davar another, as otherwise it would have been permitted without you. But this is what's called a davar asr. I might have thought v'ol mitzar. And so since you're comparing it to a davar asr, by a noser of an olah, you might have thought it doesn't take effect. So kamash malon, no, since it's the vow takes effect before it becomes a noser, therefore the vow takes effect. So
otherwise he wouldn't even be that making the vow.
Otherwise the vow would not be valid. The vow would not be valid. If you compare it to something that's a davar asr, the Gemara is going to learn out from a verse that the vow doesn't take effect. It has to be something that otherwise it would have been okay to eat. The Gemara is going to cite two possible verses later on as to how we know that well. So the Gemara now says, okay, we're still trying to answer Rami Bar Chama's question, which is if you compare it to a piece of meat of shaman that's in front of you, is it bikaro or after the fact? Obeytera kamatris. And the Gemara says meisvei. Now, really, the commentaries Rishonim point out meisvei is not the right terminology to use here. Meisvei is usually a question that's being brought against somebody, but here we're trying to bring a proof. The Rishonim say the more proper terminology here to use would be toshma. But this is another one of the examples of lashon nedarim mishuna, that the language of this tractate has its own language. So meisvei. So the Gemara says, let's try and bring a proof to Rami Bar Chama's question from the following brisa. Ezehu Isur, what is a prohibition of a vow, Hamor b'Torah? What is this vow that is prohibited in the Torah where the vow takes effect? Ezehu Isur, Hamor b'Torah. So Amar Hareini Shelo Ochal Basar. If a person says, I take upon myself, he takes a vow, even though that's also usually the vow of an oath, but here he's taking a vow that I'm not going to eat meat. And I'm not going to drink wine. And you do the vow by comparing it to something else. Kiyom Shemespo Aviv, like the day where his father has died. And that's what we call a yortzeit, right? Which and the Shulchan Aruch brings down on the day of the yortzeit, strong practice is to fast on the day of the yortzeit as a way of bringing in atonement for the neshama. So if a person says, behold, I'm not going to eat meat today or not going to drink wine today, just like the day of the yortzeit, or kiyom shemespo rabo, or like the day of my Rebbe's yortzeit, or kiyom shenerag bo Gedalia ben Achikam, or like the day that Gedalia was killed. This is what we fast on some Gedalia, or kiyom sheraisi Yerushalayim bechorbana, or like the day of that I saw Jerusalem in its destruction, which many people have the day practice to fast on that day. So we see from here that that's a vow that takes effect. So the Gemara says, V'amar Shmuel, and Shmuel says, V'husha noder ba'oso ayom. And Shmuel says that the Bryce is referring to person where the person takes the vow on the yortzeit, on that day. And he's vowing on that day that this is the day like my father, like the day of the death of my father, the death of the Rebbe. So Gemara says, so what's Shmuel referring to? Hey Chidami, what's he referring to? Rav could go into Kai B'chad B'Shabbat Demispa Avua. isn't Shmuel referring to that he's standing on the same date that his father has passed away? So that's the way we have to translate this. That he's standing, for example, the same date of the year that his father passed away. And even though that there were many other days that are similar to that day, and you could have explained that it was a Sunday, for example, and the Yom Echad B'Shabasa, and he could have said that he could have compared it to other days that were similar to that date. We'll read the Ran in a second. Vikatani Asar, and yet we're saying that we're comparing it back to the original day, the day of the Yortzeit. And we see from here, Shema Mina Be'ikar Hu Matvis. And don't we see from here that he's comparing it back to the essential aspect? So isn't that what's going on here? So let's read what the Ran says. Nira Be'enai, the Ran says, it seems to me the Hachi Perusha She'omer B'Yom Echa B'Shabbos, that he's standing there on a Sunday, Shehu B'Yom Shemeispo Aviv L'Minyan Chadashim. And that's the same date as the Yortzeit. Could go in Echa B'Shabbos, Rishon Shal Nisan. Yeah, Yom Zeh like Yom Echa B'Shabbos, Rishon Shal Nisan. He said, let's say he's standing on the first day of the Sunday in Nisan. He says, this is the day that's like the first day of Nisan. And even though there were many days prior to that were Sundays that were prohibited, nevertheless, he says that were permitted, nevertheless says it's prohibited. And so we see from here, we see from here is going back to the original date, not the dates that were permitted subsequent to that. So the Gemara's answer is no. Yeah. So Jeff has a question. Hold on.
So just going back to the beginning of this, it says, if one said, I hereby, undertake, it says here, that I will not either eat meat nor drink wine. Okay. If you just say that, isn't that enough to prohibit you? Why do you have to say on the day of?
Well, if you had just said that would have been enough. If you had just said, I'm not eating meat, I'm taking an oath, I'm not eating meat today, or drinking wine, but you didn't say that. You said today is going to be like that day. So we want to know if that's binding. You could have said that you can make a vow or an oath many different ways, but we want to know if what you said is a binding vow.
I understand. It just seems that, I asked this yesterday too, because it's confusing to me, which is if someone wants to prohibit something to themselves,
they can do so.
It seems like we're examining all the cases where it's particularly unclear.
Right, of course.
But I'm not sure why someone, except maybe in anger.
Somebody says it without thinking. They didn't come to the daf yom
without thinking. Why should that be a vow if someone says something that's not that's without thought? Like it's
that's the whole point.
Intentional. Like
the whole point is yes, you're bound by this. You're bound by this. Even you're bound by your word.
Even if you don't have a mental state for it.
You're bound by your, well, then what you do is you go to, if your mental state is in question, then you have to go to a chacham, and the chacham can undo your mental state, could go to your state of mind. But the initial assumption is that it's binding. The initial assumption is binding. Yeah, Bill, you had a question?
The other assumption is that we wouldn't just follow up and say, oh, do you mean like this day or like this day? Or do you mean like this? So the assumption is there's no follow-up for some reason.
Once the vow is binding, then you could go to the chacham, and we're going to see under what circumstances the chacham can possibly revoke a vow. But the baseline is that it'll be binding, and then you go to the chacham, and the chacham could see if it's binding.
But before you have to go to the chacham,
right?
It seems like someone could just clarify.
What he said yesterday was that usually the situation is someone says one of these things,
and then
2 days, and then later says, I didn't really mean that, right? And the question is not that. So it's the guy, it's the person who makes the vow trying to get out of it later because they changed their mind.
So Amar Ravina. So again, we're trying to answer this question. Tashma. Let's say a person says Kechalos Aaron Ukuchumaso mutter. If he says, I'm comparing my loaf of bread in front of me to like the challah of Aaron, meaning to say the mitzvah of challah, which is you're supposed to take a portion of your dough and give it to Aaron. Actually, not to Aaron, but to Aaron's descendants. Ukuchumaso, and like the truma that is separated and given to the Kohen, then the vow is not going to be binding, and it's permitted to eat from his friend. If you say, well, basically my friend's food is to me like the challah of Aaron or like his truma, it's not binding because there he's comparing it to something that's asur min Torah. The Torah says that you can't eat truma, you can't eat challah. In order for the vow to be binding, you have to do it by something that's a davar nadar and not a davar asur. And the Gemara says, so let's infer from this Mishnah that it only takes effect, that it's only permitted if you compare it to the challah or truma. But if you would compare it to the truma of the Thanksgiving offering, so then it would be prohibited. What's the truma of the Thanksgiving offering? So this is that you have you have to bring 40 loaves if you bring a Thanksgiving offering, 40 loaves. Of these 40 loaves, they're divided up into 4 different groups, 4 different types of loaves, and 4 different types, and each one is 10 loaves each. And then from that, what you have to do is you have to take a portion of that, one of each of those groups of 10, and give it to the Kohen. That's called the truma, that's separated from the chalos. So then we're going to say you can't eat from your friend, because we're going to say that the truma v'achnei toda, that's something that you vowed upon yourself, and so therefore the vow will take effect. But it says the Gemara on the top of 12b, truma slachnei toda, va'achar zrikas adamim. But the truma of the lachnei toda, that only takes effect. The practice was to separate these loaves only after the Kohen sprinkled the blood of the Thanksgiving offering, because only then would they be permitted to be eaten. And so therefore, if we're going to infer from our Mishnah that you could compare it to the lachnei toda, it must be that it was after the blood was sprinkled, because then it's allowed to be eaten. So therefore, we have to say that what we're saying is, bikaro kamatris, that you're comparing it back to its essential aspect before it became permitted. So the Gemara says, no, Ema, maybe when it says Ketruma Slach Metoda, when maybe it doesn't mean Ketruma Slach Metoda, maybe it means when it says Ketrumaso, it means not Kechalos Aaron U Ketrumaso Mutter. When it doesn't mean to the Truma of Aaron, it means Ketruma Salishka Sha'asar, not the Truma regular, but the Truma, the offerings of the that were collected. Basically, this refers to the collection that was made by the treasurer from the half shekels, that they were placed in the chamber, and then they put them in the and then they put them in the chamber. That's the Truma Salishka. That becomes that under those circumstances, that's going to be considered davar anador, and so therefore kachalas aron trumaso is permitted, but the truma salishka would be prohibited, because the truma salishka is something that was a davar anador, and so if you vowed against that, then it will be something that's prohibited. So the Gemara says, "Oh well, truma slachmei toda mai." What do you mean is, so if you compared it to the truma of the Thanksgiving offering bread, what will be the law? It'll be permitted. Well, if that's the case, lisnei lachmei toda. If that's the case, she could have said, if like the challah of Aaron or like the lachmei toda, it would be permitted. And kol shekain trumaso, and for sure, if you compare it to his own truma, it will be permitted. So because the trumaso, the lachmei toda, there's a side of it where you might have thought was a davar another. Mara says, no, no, that's exactly what our Mishnah is telling us. That the lachmei toda is, we're going to say truma lachmei toda is trumasui. That's exactly what it's telling us, is that the truma of the lachmei toda is considered, in fact, like it's truma, and therefore it's permitted if you make a vow against it. Third approach to try and answer this question of Rami Bar Chama, that if you compare the loaf of bread in front of you to like You say my friend's food, my friend's bread is like to me like this piece of basar shlamim. V'bayisema trumas lach metoda nami kodem zrikas damim hu. Could go in that for belisha. Oh, or so it's not. Maybe it's not. This is another way to say it. The trumas lach metoda is not necessarily an indication, even if you say that the trumas lach metoda is prohibited, because it's possible that you separated it before the blood was sprinkled. Like, for example, you could separate it out while it's still in its kneading stage. And we know that you could separate the truma of lach metoda while it's still in its kneading stage, like Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna said in the name of Shmuel, lach metoda. Let's say you took all this Thanksgiving bread, you have 40 loaves, but you, instead of making it into 10 separate loaves, you baked it into 4 separate loaves. Each one of these loaves has the volume of 10 loaves. Yatsa, you fulfill your obligation of making the 40 loaves. Nor says Valksib, but how could that be? Arba'im, isn't it written that you need 40? For mitzvah, just ideal you need 40. V'habai, says v'habai lo mishkol truma, but doesn't he need to separate a portion of the truma for the kohen? And you can't separate that from just these 4 loaves. So if you want to say that it'll take one challah of truma for all the chalos, it can't be. Vatinan echad mikol carbon. You need 1 truma from each types of the loaf of bread. So you told me carbon al chavero. So you can't take from one loaf on another. If you want to say, okay, just break off a little piece of bread from each one. But not echad shelo you told prusa that you have to take 1 loaf of bread from each one for the kohen. That you can't take a portion. Eladah for shinu belisha. So it must be that we're talking about that he separated it while they were still in its dough form. The shakel chadam mechametz. So he took 1 from them while they were still from chametz, v'chadam and chaos, v'chadam and rekikim, v'chadam and revucha. So it's possible that he separated 1 from each of some of the dough from each of the ones while they're still in their portion. So we've seen basically 2.5 approaches to how to answer this question. One was by comparing it to the yard site. One was now it's comparing it to the challah of Aaron and his truma. And we haven't yet answered this question of a matfis, somebody who's matfis by the basar of the shlamim. Is he going back to the ikaro, or is he going back to its current state? So the Gemara says maybe we'll take a third approach. Lema katanai. Let's say we can answer only Baruch Chama's question by saying it's machokas tanayim. If somebody says that this animal, this piece of bread of your friend is in front of you is like a firstborn animal. We know the firstborn animal has to be given to the kohen. Kohen has to slaughter it as a korban and then eat the meat, or else if it has a blemish, the kohen can eat it. Rabbi Yaakov says that in this case, the neder is chal, he's oser. The neder takes effect and it's prohibited. Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda says the vow does not take effect. Now, what are they disputing? If you want to say that they're disputing before the blood was sprinkled, and before the blood was sprinkled, then it's prohibited upon you. So my time Amanda Shari, what's the reason why Rabbi Yehuda says it's allowed? Don't we say that a bechor is not really different than all the other sacrifices, that you can make a vow by comparing the aspect to them? And so therefore it should be prohibited. My time of the mandasar, and if it's after the blood was sprinkled that you're comparing it to, well then why would it be prohibited? It must be that what must be the scenario? The machas basar bechor, machas basar, the hayakabe. We're talking about a case where there's a piece of meat, or on top of 13a of the firstborn, and a piece of meat, and your piece of meat in front of you. And you said my piece of meat is like this piece of meat, which is a bechor. Utunahi. And one position is that we go to the ikaro, and therefore your piece of meat is prohibited because comparing to the ikar, the bechor. The other piece and the other possibility is no, you compare it to what it is now, and what it is now is permitted. So it's machokas tanaim. Mar says no. Well, the kuli almo of nezri kastamim. Everybody says it's comparable to prior to the blood being sprinkled. My time at demand is shari. Well, if that's the case, why does somebody say it's? Why is the reason why one of them permits it? Amakra, This is what I was telling you before. Ki yidor, achi yidor bedavar anador. You have to take a vow on something that you could take a vow upon, meaning to say that when you take a vow, it becomes prohibited. To exclude a bechor, because a firstborn animal is born with holiness, it's always prohibited. So therefore, that's why the vow doesn't take effect on the bechor, and because the bechor is already always prohibited. It's not like a regular sheep, which you prohibit by making it your sacrifice. The bechor is always prohibited. But the one who says it's prohibited, Amakra la Hashem. The verse says explicitly, Ki ish ki yidur neder la Hashem. That comes to include Urabos Davar Asur. It comes to include something that had already been prohibited, i.e., like a Bechor. Uman de Shari La Hashem Ma'avid. So the one who says that if you compare it to the Bechor, it's permitted because it's then what does he do with the word La Hashem? He's not including something that was Davar Asur. He says, no, it's telling us that if you compare it to a chatas and asham, that it does take effect, even though the chatas and asham animal are something that becomes that you can't vow upon yourself a chatas, and so it's therefore davar asur, and so therefore it's teaching us nevertheless that if you compare it to chatas or asham, it's still going to be the vow will take effect. And Gemara asks, why do you say the vow takes effect on a chatas and asham and not on a bechor? Gemara explains, because when you take a vow on these animals, then the owner chooses them, and so therefore he's the one who consecrates them to become prohibited. And the firstborn animal is different because that's consecrated from when it's born. Manda also is Rabbi Yaakov, who says that if you're matfis b'bechor, it does take effect. Why? Wasn't it already prohibited? He says bechor nami matfiso b'nederhu. You also have to take a vow to make a bechor prohibited. Like we learned in the following brayso, Tanya, Rabbi Amru minayin noad bechor b'toch beiso shemitzvah lachtisho. Even though the animal is born as a firstborn, you still have to consecrate it. It says shenemer hazachar taktish, because it says you have to consecrate it. And whereas the position, Rabbi Yehuda says that if you compare it to the bechor, it doesn't take effect, because he says man deshari ki lo makdash le mi lo mikdash. Even if you wouldn't consecrate it, it would still be consecrated. Okay, so the Gemara says, the Gemara basically leaves this question unresolved. We didn't answer Rami Bar Chama's question. All right, we'll stop here.